Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I moved into the house in Perth at the beginning of winter, when the days were still warm but the nights dropped into that cold that finds its way into your bones. The place looked normal from the street, a single-story home with pale brick, a narrow driveway, and a thin strip of grass that never seemed to grow evenly. Inside, though, it felt older than its age. The walls had that faint smell of dust trapped behind paint, and the floors creaked in small, sharp notes whenever I put weight on them. I told myself all older homes had quirks, and I was too tired from weeks of moving and packing to care about anything strange. The living room held the most leftover items from the previous owner. There was an old wooden cabinet with scratches across the top, a dented metal heater that didn't work, and those heavy beige curtains that hung across the wide front window. They were made of thick fabric that felt rough when I ran my hand across it, the type you would find in motels where no one wanted to spend more than one night. I planned to replace them eventually, but told myself I would do it after settling in. The rod holding them up was dark metal and looked strong enough to carry the weight of the fabric. My second night should have been quiet. No traffic reached the house, no neighbors seemed to be awake past sunset, and the wind outside barely moved the trees. I was sitting in the living room, trying to get through a bit more unpacking while the heater failed to warm the room. It was around 9 when I noticed the curtains shift. Not a soft ripple, not a gentle fall of cloth. It was a firm sway, the kind that happens when someone brushes past from behind. I froze where I stood. I knew I hadn't opened any windows. I checked earlier that day that the vents didn't work at all, and nothing else in the room could have caused it. I kept standing there, staring at those curtains, waiting for them to move again. For a while, they stayed still. The room felt colder, not because of the temperature, but because I was now aware of how quiet the house actually was. It was the kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound too loud. When the curtains shifted again, slower this time but still firm, I felt something tighten in my stomach. I remember telling myself it had to be the fabric settling, or maybe the rod shifting. But even as I said it in my mind, I knew it wasn't true. The sway was too controlled, too smooth, like something had caused it directly. I tried to ignore it, but the thought crawled around in my head for the rest of the night. When I walked past the living room, I held my breath and kept my eyes straight. I slept badly. Every noise the house made felt sharper than it should have. I kept waking up, thinking I heard something sliding or brushing against a wall. The next morning I walked straight to the curtains. I wanted to believe I'd imagined everything. When I touched the fabric, it felt cold, almost damp, but the air around it wasn't damp at all. I grabbed the edges and pulled them to the side to let light in. The sunlight hit the floor in a thin rectangle, and for a moment, everything looked normal. It made me feel foolish for being scared over something so simple. But when I let go, the fabric settled in a way that didn't make sense. Instead of falling straight down, it tilted slightly, like the top was uneven. That was when I noticed the rod. It wasn't straight. In the middle, the metal curved up, a clear bend that couldn't have happened from just the weight of the curtains. It looked as if someone had grabbed onto it with both hands and pulled down their weight, or hung from it. The bend was too clean to be accidental. I reached up and placed my hand on it, feeling the uneven shape under my palm. The thought of someone using it to support themselves, leaning or hanging, sat heavy in my chest. I tried to think of a reason that made sense. Maybe the previous owner had kids who liked to climb things. Maybe someone had tried to stand on a chair and slipped, catching themselves on the rod. But even those ideas didn't feel right. The rod was too high for that. No adult could reach it easily without standing on something, and the curtains would have shown signs of tearing if someone had used them to climb. I kept looking at it, trying to make the shape match something familiar, but it only made me feel worse. The room felt different now, like the air itself was holding something back. That night the sounds returned. It started with a faint thump, like something settling against the wall. Then a slow dragging sound. I kept telling myself houses make noises, but the sounds happened only when I walked into the room and stopped when I stepped back. It was as if I was disturbing something that had already been disturbed before I even moved in. I stood in the doorway for several long minutes, watching the curtains again. They swayed the same way they had the night before. That firm motion like someone shifting behind them. My skin prickled, and I felt a rush of cold down my back. I decided I needed to take them down. The feeling in that room was too much to ignore. I grabbed a chair from the dining area and dragged it across the floor. The scraping sound echoed through the house and made me feel exposed, as if something in the house now knew exactly where I was. I climbed up and reached for the rod. It felt heavier in my hands than it should have, and the bend in the middle felt sharper now that I was closer to it. When I lifted the rod off the hooks, the curtains fell forward, brushing against my face. The fabric smelled stale, with a faint oily scent clinging to it, like old skin or sweat trapped over time. I stepped down from the chair, holding the rod in one hand and letting the curtains pool on the floor. When I lifted the fabric away from the wall, I saw the marks. Two faint, greasy handprints were pressed into the paint behind where the curtains had hung. They were as clear as if someone had pressed their hands there recently, but the shape was wrong. Higher than any adult could reach without climbing up on something. The fingers were long, smudged at the ends and curved slightly inward. I lifted my own hand to compare, and the prints were higher than the top of my reach. I felt something shift in my chest, a tight pressure that made me swallow hard. There was no reason for those handprints to be there. No reason for them to be so high. No reason for the grease to still look fresh. I ran my hand across the wall. The texture felt smooth, but the marks didn't smear. It was like they had seeped into the paint itself. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wall, waiting for some explanation to come to me. Nothing did. Over the following days, the house didn't calm down. Without the curtains, the room felt exposed, like something had been forced into the open and didn't like it. At night, the sounds didn't stop. I heard shifting, like something settling weight on the wall. I heard faint taps from high on the ceiling, too high for me to reach even with a chair. Once, when I walked past the living room, I felt a brief pressure on the floorboards beneath my feet, as if someone had stepped down on the other side of the room at the same time. The air felt heavier too, especially near the window. I started keeping the hallway light on at night, not because I thought it would protect me, but because the darkness in the living room felt too thick. Still, even with the light on, I kept waking up. My sleep felt shallow, like I was only half asleep, always listening. The noise would stop whenever I got out of bed, then start again when I lay back down. It was a cycle I couldn't escape. After nearly a week of this, I decided I needed to check the outside of the house. Maybe there was something structural behind the wall. Maybe the marks were from moisture or old damage. I walked around the house in the morning light, checking every part of the exterior wall. Nothing was there. No stains, no cracks, no signs of damage. The outside wall looked untouched, which made the handprints inside feel even worse. Standing in the yard, I felt watched. It wasn't the usual sense of being in an open space. It felt focused, like something was fixed on me from inside the house. When I looked through the living room window, the empty space where the curtains had been looked darker than the rest of the room. That darkness felt like an open mouth. I went back inside, my steps slow, each foot landing too heavily on the floorboards. I walked toward the living room, and the closer I got, the colder the air felt. When I stepped into the room, a rush of pressure hit my ears, like the air had shifted around me. I placed my hand on the wall again, right where the prints were. The wall felt warm. Not room temperature warm. Body warm, like someone had just pressed their hand there. That was when I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever had caused those prints, whatever had bent the rod, whatever kept shifting the air in the room, it was still there. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't the house settling. It was something physical. Something that moved and pressed and shifted with weight. Something that lived in the narrow spaces above the window and behind the walls. I packed slowly, taking only what I needed. Every hour I stayed felt like I was pushing my luck. Before leaving, I looked one last time at the wall behind the window. The prints were still there. The wall still felt warm. The room felt thick with something I couldn't see. I didn't try to understand it anymore. I didn't want to. The ending was simple. I left the house. I handed the keys back and didn't ask for my deposit. I moved into a smaller place nearer the city, and even now, months later, I don't hang thick curtains. I keep my windows clear and my walls clear, because I have no interest in covering spaces that hide things. I still think about those handprints sometimes. About how high they were, about the warmth of the wall, about how the rod bent upward like something had been hanging from it, holding its weight with slow, steady strength. Nothing followed me. Nothing strange ever happened in the new place. That house in Perth was the problem, not me. And leaving it behind was the only thing that made the weight of it finally lift. I moved into the house in Rochester at the beginning of October, when the weather still felt warm, but the days had started to shrink. The place had a wide, unfinished basement with cracked concrete, exposed joists, and one narrow horizontal window that sat at ground level. The inspector had told me it was structurally sound, just old, and I liked the idea of having a big space where I could build things. I planned to turn a part of it into a workshop. I had a folding table, a few power tools, and the quiet feeling of opportunity that comes from standing inside an empty room where anything could be shaped. The first few days were a blur of moving, unpacking, and dragging cardboard boxes down the stairs. The basement smelled like old dust and dried-out timber. When I walked across the concrete, the sound echoed in a hollow way that I figured was normal for an empty space. There were old metal brackets along the walls, and some of them rattled when I brushed past. Nothing felt alarming. It was just a place that needed use, and I was ready to give it purpose. During the first week, I set up a small workbench and plugged in my circular saw. I wanted to cut a sheet of plywood for a shelf project. The moment I squeezed the trigger and heard the saw spin up, I also heard a sharp metallic echo behind me. It sounded like someone had dropped a small metal object further back in the room. I let go of the trigger immediately. The saw spun down, but the noise continued. 3 quick metallic clinks spaced less than a second apart. For a moment I stood still, holding the saw by the handle, looking over my shoulder into the dim area near the old water heater. Nothing moved. The house felt quiet again. The metallic sound had already stopped. I told myself it was something normal. Maybe an old pipe responding to vibrations or an object I had accidentally shifted. The basement shelves still held a few stray screws and bolts the previous owner had left behind. Maybe something had rolled. It wasn't worth worrying about. I checked the floor anyway. I took slow steps, scanning the concrete, expecting to see a washer or a small tool that had dropped. There was nothing. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered it. I stood near the water heater and looked at the copper lines running up into the ceiling. They were old, carrying the dull dark color that metal gets after years of humidity changes. Maybe they made noise when the house vibrated. That explanation felt good enough. But the next day, when I used my drill, the same thing happened. I pressed the trigger. The motor started whirring, and right behind it came that metallic echo, almost like it was copying the sound, but turning it into something sharper and shorter. 3 clinks. Always 3. I walked around the basement again, more annoyed than alarmed, trying to find something loose. I pushed on the pipes. I tapped the metal shelves. I kicked a scrap piece of conduit that had been left against the wall. Nothing matched the sound I had heard. I told myself old houses do strange things. I left it there. As days went by, the pattern continued. Every time I used a tool, any tool that vibrated or made noise, the basement answered with those 3 metallic clinks, coming a fraction of a second later. It never happened when I walked, never happened when I talked on the phone upstairs, never happened when the furnace turned on. Only when I used a tool. It began to eat at my nerves. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt targeted, like it responded directly to my actions. After a while, I started hesitating before picking up a tool, just because I didn't want to hear that echo again. One evening, I decided to record it. I wanted proof so I could think about it more calmly, maybe compare the sound to things online or ask someone who knew more about old houses. I opened the voice recorder on my phone, set it on the workbench, and started the circular saw again. Right on cue, the clinks followed. I stopped the saw, picked up the phone, and played back the recording. On the playback, the saw sounded normal, the motor humming in a way I recognized. Then came the 3 clinks. But the recorded version didn't sound like what I heard with my own ears. There was a faint scratching noise layered underneath, almost like someone dragging a piece of metal across a concrete floor. And under that, just barely, something that sounded like a breath pushing through a tight space. It wasn't a voice, not a clear one, but something about the tone made my stomach twist. It was lower than anything I had heard in the room physically. I played it again and leaned in close. There was a faint pattern, something that could almost be mistaken for a word, if someone was determined enough. The sound reminded me of air pushing through small gaps, like something trying to escape a sealed space. I put the phone down and forced myself to think rationally. Phones glitch, microphones distort, audio picks up interference, basements have strange acoustics. I repeated these ideas until I felt steady again. I deleted the file without giving myself a chance to obsess over it. But deleting the recording didn't erase the feeling the noise left behind. I kept thinking about the small window near the ceiling. It was covered with grime on the outside. I wondered if animals had burrowed near it, or if there were openings in the foundation letting mice or raccoons inside the walls. I told myself it could be something like that. The next morning, I started searching the entire basement more methodically. I traced every pipe, knocked on every board, checked under the stairs, looked behind the furnace, and even got down on my hands and knees to inspect the floor near the old drain. There were hairline cracks in the concrete, but nothing that seemed big enough to cause noise. Still, something about the drain bothered me. The metal cover looked older than the rest of the house, worn and slightly warped. When I pressed on one corner of it, it wobbled slightly. I made a mental note to replace it. In the days that followed, the noise started happening even when I wasn't using a tool. I would set something down on the workbench, not even loudly, and the basement would answer with those same clinks. Sometimes I would hear them when I stepped onto the bottom stair. It began to feel like the room was reacting to movement itself. I tried to ignore it, but I caught myself pausing before walking down the stairs, listening for anything waiting in the stillness below. The turning point came late one night, when I couldn't sleep and decided to go down to check the humidity level in the basement. I had been worried about moisture affecting the lumber. I kept down there. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air felt cooler than usual, almost damp. I walked across the concrete and heard the familiar echo, but this time it wasn't 3 clinks. It was one long dragging sound that made the hair on my arms rise. I stood completely still, waiting for it to repeat. It didn't. The room went totally silent, except for my own breathing. I backed away slowly and went back upstairs without finishing what I came to do. The next morning, I decided I needed to figure out what was underneath the drain cover. I waited until the sun was fully up and the house felt normal again. I got a screwdriver, knelt on the concrete, and pried the cover loose. It lifted with a soft scraping noise, revealing a narrow vertical shaft lined with rough concrete. The air coming from it smelled stale, like old soil. I aimed a flashlight down and saw nothing but a long, dark hollow that vanished deeper than I expected. I couldn't see any pipes, no underground water movement, nothing that connected to my plumbing. The depth seemed wrong for a house like mine. It was too deep, too narrow, and too roughly built. I lowered the light again and studied the walls of the shaft. On one side, there were faint scrape marks, thin and irregular, as if something metallic had been dragged against the concrete over and over again. At the very bottom of the shaft, maybe 8 or 9 feet down, I saw a small metallic object partially buried in dust and debris. It looked like a large bolt or some piece of hardware. My first thought was that it had fallen from the foundation work years ago, maybe when the house was being built. But the scrape marks bothered me. They were too many, too recent looking, too sharp. I felt uneasy staring at them. I stood up, stepped back, and just stared at the opening in the floor. The clinks I had been hearing matched exactly what that loose piece of metal would sound like if it were shifting or tapping against something. I imagined the house vibrating when the tools were running, sending subtle movements down through the concrete. That could make the metal shift. That could make the echo. That could explain everything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening. Something about the depth of that shaft and the scrape marks that didn't belong. I sat down on the bottom step and thought about next steps. I didn't like the idea of sealing it back up without knowing more. So I called a foundation specialist and scheduled a full inspection. I told them I had found an old drain opening that didn't look standard. When the inspector arrived 2 days later, he spent nearly an hour checking everything: walls, joists, the floor, pipes, and finally the drain. He dropped a weighted string into the shaft and measured it, said the opening didn't match the house's original plans, and that it looked like someone had dug an old utility access long before the last renovation. He told me it wasn't dangerous, but it should be cleaned out and sealed, because it could attract pests or allow moisture into the basement. He didn't mention the scrape marks. He didn't seem bothered by them. That gave me enough reassurance to act. I bought a heavy-duty brush, gloves, and a shop vacuum. I spent half a day clearing out the debris at the bottom. When I finally reached the metallic object, I pulled it up. It was a rusted steel bracket, bent and irregular. It looked like it had been part of something larger, maybe a support piece from decades ago. When I knocked it against the floor, the sound matched the echo I had heard. Not perfectly, but close enough that I felt a wave of relief loosen my chest. I bagged it and threw it out. After cleaning the shaft, I filled the bottom with gravel, laid a moisture barrier over it, and installed a new sealed cover. The basement felt different after that. Quieter, more settled, almost like the air had steadied. I used my circular saw again the next day, waiting for the echo. Nothing answered. I tried the drill, the sander, even the hammer. Still nothing. The space stayed silent except for the normal sound of tools hitting wood. The silence felt heavy but peaceful, the kind of quiet that means something has finally been put to rest. In the end, the explanation was simple. The metallic echo had been a piece of old hardware, shifting in a forgotten shaft beneath the basement. The noise on the recording had been microphone distortion and the acoustics of a hollow space. Once the loose metal was removed and the opening sealed, everything returned to normal. The house wasn't haunted. The basement wasn't alive. It was just an old structure holding onto old parts, making old noises that needed to be understood. The experience changed the way I think about houses, though. Every strange sound has a cause, even if the cause isn't obvious at first. Sometimes it takes digging into the hidden spaces, the forgotten corners, the places that no one has looked at in decades. When I walk into the basement now, it feels like a place I have earned, a space I understand fully. The air is dry, the tools stay quiet, and the concrete holds steady under my feet. The echo is gone for good, and the room finally feels like mine. When I bought the old A-frame cabin on the north edge of Flagstaff, I told myself I wanted quiet. I had left a loud apartment building, left constant traffic noise, left the routine of living around people who were always awake at the wrong hours. The cabin looked small from the outside, with dark wood siding that had turned nearly black from years of sun and cold. The realtor warned me that the place was old and had its quirks, and she mentioned the attic door sticking sometimes because of what she called settling. I did not think much of it. Every old house I had lived in had a door or window that stuck. I assumed it was just another small issue I would get used to. The first nights there felt both peaceful and unsettling. The air always smelled faintly of pine and cold earth. The place held on to cold even when the sun was high, and the floors creaked under every step. I slept in a small bedroom under the slanted roof, with the attic access hatch directly above the far corner. It was a low square door you pulled down with a short rope. I remember standing there on the first day, looking up at it and thinking it felt too close for comfort, like it watched over everything in the room. On the third night, I heard the first sound. It was a soft creak, not loud but sharp enough that it came through the quiet of the house. I was lying in bed, half asleep. At first, I thought it was one of the beams cooling. The cabin made all kinds of noises as temperatures shifted. But this one repeated. It was slow and rhythmic, like pressure on wood. Then release, then pressure again. I stared at the ceiling and tried to place it. It was directly above me, where the attic door sat in its frame. I told myself it was just thermal expansion, or maybe wind pushing against the roof. I tried to sleep, but every few minutes, there it was again. I turned on my side, pulled the blankets up, and ignored it the best I could. When morning came, I had only slept in short stretches. The next night, the sound was louder. It came just past midnight. I woke to the familiar creaking, but this time it came with a soft tap, like something shifting its weight on the floor above. The cabin had no second story. Only the attic was up there. I lay completely still, listening. The sound moved slightly, as if whatever caused it was changing position. Something about it felt deliberate. Not random, not wind moving through boards. It felt like weight. When I got up the next morning, I pulled down the attic rope to check the door, more out of irritation than fear. It came down with more ease than the realtor had described. The door did not seem stuck. I stared at the dark opening above the ladder for a moment, but I did not climb up. I had no reason to, I told myself. I pushed it back into place and went about my day, but the thought stayed with me that night. On the fifth night, the sound changed again. Instead of creaking, I heard a slow drag, something scraping lightly across the attic floor. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped, then started again. A long, slow shift. I could feel tension in every part of my body, like I was waiting for something to happen. It felt like someone kneeling above me, shifting their weight a little at a time. The boards overhead flexed just enough to make tiny noises, and every one of them made my skin crawl. The next morning, I decided to jam the door from below. I found an old broom left by the previous owner and wedged the handle between the attic pull rope and my dresser. I pushed it until it felt solid. I even tugged the rope a few times to make sure it would not budge. That gave me a small sense of control, but it did not last. That night, the creaking started again. I stared at the ceiling and waited to hear the sound of the broom falling or the door shifting. For a while, nothing else happened. But when the sun came up and I walked into the bedroom, the door was open. The broom lay on the floor, angled as if it had been knocked aside gently, not forced out. The attic door hung halfway open, the rope swinging slightly. I felt a tightness in my chest I had not felt before. I closed it quickly, but something about the way it hung loose felt wrong. I spent most of that day trying to brush it off by doing chores around the cabin. But every time I passed the bedroom doorway, I glanced up at the ceiling, expecting to see the door hanging open again. On the 7th day, I decided I needed proof of what was happening. I was tired of not understanding. I had read somewhere that placing flour on a floor could show prints or marks. I found a bag of cheap flour in the pantry left by whoever lived there before me. Just before bed, I pulled the attic rope down, opened the door, and poured a clean pile of flour on the first few wooden steps. I made sure the surface was flat and untouched. I climbed down, pushed the door back into place, and checked it twice. I went to bed feeling anxious but determined. I thought if I could see what made the noise, I could explain it. Maybe there was an animal up there. A raccoon or something similar. Flagstaff had plenty of wildlife. I listened again that night as the same slow shifting noise came from above. It lasted longer than usual, with long pauses between sounds. It felt like something was sliding itself across the boards, not walking. In the morning, I walked to the bedroom feeling a pressure in my ribs. Before I even turned the corner, I knew the door would be open. I could feel it, and it was. Fully open this time, not halfway. The rope hung down straight. I swallowed hard and stepped closer. When I climbed the first rung of the ladder and looked at the flour, I froze. The flour was untouched. No prints. No scattered dust. Just a clean, even surface. Except for one thing. Down the center of the pile, cutting from the top step to the bottom, was a single long line. Perfectly smooth. As if something had dragged its full weight across the floor without lifting any part of itself. The line was too even to be a tail or a hand or a paw. It was a single, wide drag mark, like something long and heavy had slid across the boards in one slow movement. My stomach dropped. There was no animal I could think of that moved like that. Nothing that would leave no prints at all. I stared at it for several minutes, trying to make sense of it. The boards beyond the flour showed the same smooth line continuing deeper into the attic, disappearing into the dark corner I had never explored. Something about that perfect line made the attic feel wrong in a way I could not dismiss. It was the kind of detail that stayed in the mind, refusing to be rationalized. I closed the attic door carefully and backed away. The air in the room felt thicker, like the temperature had risen even though it was still early morning. I stood in the doorway and knew I would not sleep in that room again. I moved my mattress into the living room and kept every light on that night. Over the next few days, I avoided the attic entirely. I kept the rope tied to a heavy box so the door could not fall open on its own. The cabin still made noises, but now every small creak pulled my attention toward the ceiling. I found myself listening for the slow shifting sound, waiting for it to return, but it never did after I placed the flour. The silence somehow felt worse, like whatever had been moving up there was waiting too. The turning point came on the 10th morning. I woke early and saw dust on the hallway floor, a thin scatter of pale powder that had fallen straight down from the cracks around the attic hatch. It looked like flour, but I had not touched the attic since that day. I looked up and saw that the hatch had shifted in its frame. Not open, but off-center, as if weight had pressed against it from above. That was enough. I packed my things that afternoon. I did not make a big plan. I just knew I needed to leave. I booked a small rental in town and arranged for someone else to check the cabin before I put it back on the market. When I locked the door for the last time, I could still feel that same pressure above me, that same sense of something waiting overhead. The inspector later told me the attic boards were warped. He said uneven weight over many years can cause wood to bend in smooth curves. He said the line in the flour was probably caused by the draft from the open door. He listed these things like they were simple truths. I nodded and let him talk. But none of it matched what I had heard at night. or the way the boards had flexed under something slow and heavy, or the way the flower had been carved with such perfect steadiness. I never stayed in that cabin again. I never went back inside after that day. I still think about the sound above my bed, the slow shifting weight, and that straight carved line in the flower. I think about the silence after, the kind that feels like something holding its breath. I tell myself it was just the structure of an old house, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw. There was something in that attic, something with real weight, something that moved in a way I could not explain. And whatever it was, it wanted space. It wanted quiet. It wanted to move without being seen. And I am certain it was still up there the day I left, waiting in that dark corner behind the smooth line in the boards, settled into the house in a way I never could be. I moved into the townhouse in Bath at the beginning of autumn, when the streets smelled faintly of wet stone and fallen leaves. The building was narrow but tall, 3 floors stacked above a ground floor entryway that felt colder than the rest of the place. I chose it because it was quiet, close to the river, and newly renovated, at least everywhere except the 3rd floor. That level was older, with uneven floorboards and walls that carried a faint smell of dust, no matter how long the windows stayed open. The small study was there, tucked at the end of a short hallway where the light never quite reached. During the showing, the study had been empty. The real estate agent mentioned it only in passing, saying it had character, a word I had learned usually meant unfinished, old, or in need of work. But I liked the location, and the other rooms were clean and bright, so I didn't think much about the small door with its old iron lock. It looked original to the house, scratched and dark from age, with a large brass key that hung loosely from a bit of frayed twine. I didn't try to open it then. A few days after moving in, I finally went up to the 3rd floor with the intention of clearing the space. The hallway smelled slightly damp, the way closed-off rooms do after sitting unused. The door to the study was colder to the touch than the wall beside it. I slid the large key into the lock, turned it once, and felt resistance, then heard a snap. The key broke cleanly inside, leaving half of it lodged deep in the mechanism. The lock clicked in a way that didn't sound normal. I tried pulling it out with my fingers, then with pliers, but the metal piece was stuck too tightly. I planned to call a locksmith the next day. The study could wait. That night, however, as I lay in bed on the floor below, I heard something faint. At first I thought it was the house settling, the way older houses shift slightly with temperature changes. But the sound didn't spread, it stayed localized, steady, soft. It came from directly above me, from the 3rd floor hallway. It sounded like scratching, slow, light, almost hesitant, something dragging lightly across wood. I stayed still, listening carefully, holding my breath. I told myself it could be a mouse, or even a distant branch scraping against the exterior wall. But the sound came in short bursts, 3 or 4 quick strokes, then silence. Then it would start again. It was too regular, too close, and it had a strange dry quality, like a fingernail on old paneling. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't even move. I waited until the noise stopped, and when the house fell silent again, I remained awake for a long time. Eventually, exhaustion pushed me into sleep. When morning came, cold pale light filled the stairwell. I went upstairs slowly, expecting the door to still be locked. Instead, I found it slightly open, just enough to show a sliver of the dim room inside. The broken key was still in the lock, but the mechanism had shifted. The latch was drawn back, even though there was no way to turn it from the outside. My first thought was that the lock had failed on its own overnight. It was old enough. Maybe the weight of the key fragment pushed it loose. I pushed the door open and let the morning light spill inside. The study was empty. No boxes, no furniture, no dust sheets. Nothing except a single wooden chair. It was pushed against the far wall facing the corner. The back legs were only a few inches from the plaster, and the seat was angled, so that anyone sitting on it would be staring directly into the corner, not out toward the room. It hadn't been there during the showing. I remembered the bare floor, the echo inside the room. I also knew I hadn't moved anything into the study since I first arrived. The chair was old too, with a faded seat cushion and scratches along the back. There were marks on the floor beneath it, faint arcs where the legs had scraped across the boards at some earlier time. The air in the room felt still, colder than the hallway. I dragged the chair out into the light and checked the walls. There were thin, uneven scratches along the lower paneling, almost hidden by the dark wood. They looked like they had been made over a long period of time, not by a single event. They were all at the same height, near where a hand would rest if someone were sitting there and reaching out. I left the room, shut the door, and didn't touch the lock again. For the rest of the day, I tried to focus on unpacking, but my mind kept replaying the sound from the night before, the slow dragging, the strange rhythm. I kept telling myself it had to be something normal. Houses make all kinds of noises, especially older ones. Maybe the chair had been left from the previous owner, and I had simply overlooked it. Maybe the door had always been slightly open, and I remembered it wrong in the morning light. But those explanations never sat comfortably in my mind. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual, listening to the wind outside. When the house grew quiet, I heard it again. Faint, soft, slow, scratching in the same rhythm. But this time, it didn't come from directly above. It came from farther down the hall on the third floor, like something shifting its position. I listened for nearly an hour. The scratching would stop for long stretches, then start again. I never heard footsteps or door hinges, just the same dry contact between something soft and the paneling. It made the hairs on my arms rise because it felt too controlled, too deliberate. The next morning, I went upstairs again. The study door was closed, and the lock looked unchanged. I checked the room anyway. The chair had moved. It still faced the same corner, but it was pulled farther into the room by about a foot, leaving a cleaner patch of floor behind it where dust had been disturbed. The faint leg marks showed a new set of arcs, fresh scratches that still had small curls of wood beside them. I pushed it back to the wall and left again. I had no explanation for it. I didn't want one. I tried to convince myself that I might have bumped it the day before when pulling it out, but I remembered clearly how carefully I had moved it. I remembered exactly where it had been. I started avoiding the third floor. I kept the hallway door closed, telling myself it was just to keep heat from escaping upward. In reality, I didn't want to hear anything from above. I slept lightly, listening for sounds without meaning to, waking up at small shifts in the house's structure. 2 nights passed without noise. I thought the worst of it might be over. On the third night, a different sound woke me. It wasn't scratching this time. It was the solid, muted sound of wood shifting, like a chair leg dragging once across a wooden floor. It came from directly above me again, right from the study's location. I lay in bed, trying very hard not to picture the room. Not the chair waiting in the corner. Not the scratches in the paneling. Not the cold air. My chest felt tight. When the sound didn't repeat, I eventually fell asleep. In the morning, I forced myself upstairs. The study door was open again just slightly. The chair was closer to the center of the room. It still faced the corner, but now it was angled slightly differently, as if someone had sat in it and shifted their weight. On the floor beside one leg, I found a small piece of wood. It looked like it had splintered off from the leg itself. That was enough for me. I called a locksmith that morning and booked the earliest appointment. I felt uneasy the entire day until he arrived. He took one look at the lock and shook his head, saying it was likely to fail again due to age, so he replaced it with a modern one. He asked if I wanted the old lock removed entirely. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. Once he left, I removed the chair completely. I carried it downstairs, set it outside next to the bins, and made sure it wouldn't be coming back inside. The room felt different after that. Still cold, still empty, but without that focused tension it had carried before. I swept the floor and wiped down the walls, removing the thin layer of dust and the small wood curls left from the scratches. For the first time, the room felt like just a room. That night, the house was silent. No scratching, no shifting, no dragging. I slept through until morning without waking once. In the days that followed, I started using the study slowly. I placed a small table by the window and kept the door open during the day. The room still had an odd feeling to it, but it was different now, less oppressive, more like a place that had been closed for too long and was finally filling with normal sounds and light. I never heard the scratching again. The new lock stayed firm, and the door didn't open unless I opened it. The chair was taken away on collection day, and I didn't replace it for weeks. When I finally did bring a new one in, I chose a modern metal frame chair with rubber tips on the legs, nothing that could scrape quietly across wood. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the way the old chair was angled toward the corner, the way the floor showed years of marks, the way the paneling was scratched at just the right height for a resting hand. I'll never know who used that room before me, or why they sat the way they did, or why the noises continued even after the door was untouched for years. But the house has been quiet since the day I removed the chair, and the study, despite its old walls and cold air, has stayed still. For me, that was enough to settle into the place and move on with my life, knowing that whatever was wrong in that room belonged to the past, not to anything inside the house with me. I moved into the townhouse on a gray afternoon in early winter, the kind of day in Reykjavik when the light never fully arrives and everything feels half frozen before evening even begins. The place was small but practical, and it had the kind of quiet that made me feel like I could finally settle down after years of moving from one rental to another. The house had 3 bedrooms, though only one was large enough to use as my own. The smallest one was at the far end of the upper floor, tucked under the slope of the roof. I planned to turn it into a storage room, or maybe a workspace later, once everything else was in order. On my first walkthrough, the room felt cold, but I didn't think much of it. The heating in Icelandic houses can be uneven sometimes, especially older ones with radiators that take a while to wake up. I turned the heat up and went on with unpacking. By the time night came, the main rooms were warm enough that I didn't think twice about it. The next morning, I stepped into the small room again to drop off some boxes. The air inside was stiff and cold, colder than the hallway by a huge difference. I stood still for a few seconds, letting the feelings sink in. The cold wasn't the normal sort of morning chill. It felt collected, focused, almost like stepping into a walk-in freezer someone forgot to close. I checked the radiator. Hot. It was actually warmer than the one in my bedroom. The window was shut tight. No cracks. The walls were dry. There was no reason for the temperature to be this low. I left the door open for the rest of the day, hoping the heat from the hallway would balance it out. Hours later, when I checked again, the cold was still there, untouched. That night I kept thinking about it even though I tried not to. I kept picturing the room, how the air felt still and unmoving, how the cold sat inside it like a weight. I told myself it was probably insulation, maybe a draft I hadn't found yet. Old houses have their own strange habits, and I figured I just needed time to understand mine. A few days passed before the worst part happened. I had been cleaning and organizing the upstairs rooms. I opened the small bedroom door again, hoping maybe it had warmed up even a little. But the moment I stepped inside, the temperature hit me. It was even colder than before. My breath fogged the air instantly, like I had walked into a place meant for storing meat. I pulled my arm back when I felt the cold biting at my skin, deeper than it should have. That made me turn around and look at the floor. The floorboards were old but solid. I moved slowly, sliding my foot across the wood, feeling for changes. The boards near the door were warm, normal. The ones near the window were a little cooler, nothing strange. But when I reached the far side of the room, close to the wall, my foot froze against the surface. The spot was ice cold, far colder than any natural draft could cause. I crouched down and placed my hand over it. The wood felt almost wet from how cold it was, like something was draining all the heat out of it. As I leaned closer, I heard it. A short breath, soft but sharp. Not from the room, not from the walls, but from somewhere under the floor. It sounded like someone letting out a long, slow exhale, after holding it in too long. I froze in place. I listened for it again. Nothing followed. The silence held thick and heavy, and I waited until the chill in my knees became too much and I stood up. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that cold patch, imagined something under the boards waiting silently. I kept trying to think of a basic explanation. Air pressure, ventilation, animals, old pipes, something normal and boring. But none of those things breathe like that. And none of them turn one specific square of floorboards into something that feels like a block of ice in a house that's otherwise warm. The next morning, I decided I needed to check beneath the floor. I didn't want to, but the idea of leaving it alone made it worse. I didn't like the thought of something hidden down there, heating and cooling in ways it shouldn't. The boards in old Icelandic houses can usually be lifted if you pry gently along the seams. I brought up a flat tool from the kitchen and pushed it under the cold board, easing the wood upward. It gave slowly, resisting at first, then lifting just enough for me to get my fingers under it. The underside of the board was damp, not enough for mold but enough to show moisture that shouldn't be there. I set it aside and looked down. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. The subfloor space was shallow and narrow, not meant for storage or access. I leaned down closer, letting my eyes adjust. The air rising from the gap felt cooler than the room, but not unbearably so. It smelled faintly of wet earth, a smell houses sometimes get when the foundations sit too close to the groundwater. I reached in with my hand, sweeping along the dirt, feeling for anything unusual. My fingertips brushed something soft at first, then something that felt like fabric. I pulled back quickly. I reached again, slower this time, and pulled out the object. It was a glove, a small, dark glove, stiff from age, coated at the edges with hardened grime. I turned it over in my hands and felt my stomach tighten. It was a child's glove, old, thin, and frayed, the kind someone might wear in harsh winters decades ago. Finding it didn't explain the cold, but it made everything feel heavier. I kept looking into the gap, reaching deeper. My hand brushed something else, another glove, then something flat like paper. I pulled the items out one by one. A pair of gloves, a small wooden toy horse with the paint almost fully gone, a few scraps of what looked like old cloth. The more I pulled out, the more I understood that someone had stored these things under the floor a very long time ago. Maybe before insulation was even added. Maybe before the house was even wired properly. But one thing stood out. Each time I lowered my hand toward the far wall, I felt a faint rush of air moving past my knuckles, steady and controlled like a slow breath. I held still, waiting. The air moved again, the same faint exhale I had heard the night before. It finally clicked that the subfloor space must connect to some old ventilation shaft or unused crawl space. Something small and forgotten that ran under the house. Airflow through narrow old structures can create strange sounds, especially when blocked by objects or changes in pressure. If the cold outside funneled through the earth around the house and fed into that space, it could easily chill a specific patch of floor. It didn't comfort me, though. The feeling of the breath against my skin had felt too human. I didn't want to leave the floor open, so I gathered the objects into a box and sealed the gap with the board again. I pressed down hard until it fit back into place. For the rest of the day, I kept the box on the kitchen table and stared at it from time to time. The items inside were harmless on their own, but something about knowing they had been hidden under that ice-cold spot for decades gave me a feeling I couldn't shake off. The house had been lived in many times before me. Families, couples, renters, people passing through. Someone must have put those things under there for a reason. That night I heard the cold room door creak open. The sound carried down the hallway in a slow, dragging tone. I stayed in bed and listened. The cold air drifted down the hallway, settling into the house like a low fog. My room's radiator struggled to keep the warmth steady. By morning, I made a decision. I didn't want to keep second, guessing what was under that room, or why it stayed so cold, or whether the sound really was air moving through old passages. I decided to have professionals look at it. Structural inspectors, heating specialists, anyone who could break down the problem with certainty. They came 2 days later and started by checking the radiators, the insulation, the outer walls. Everything came back normal. Then they checked beneath the small room's floor. They found a narrow crawl space running along the edge of the foundation. It was an old ventilation design abandoned many years ago. Cold air from the earth moved through it, funneled in one direction, creating pressure pockets that made the boards breathe in strange ways. That explained the exhale sound. It also explained why the cold stayed trapped in that room. Knowing the cause helped, but the feeling it left behind didn't go away. I had lived with the idea of something hidden under the floor long enough for it to leave a mark in my mind. Even when the inspectors blocked off the crawl space and sealed the drafts, the room stayed empty. The cold faded slowly over time, but I never used the room for anything. I kept the box of old items stored in a cabinet downstairs. I didn't throw them away, even though I considered it many times. They were harmless objects, but they reminded me of the moment I thought something was breathing under my floorboards. In a way, keeping them made everything feel resolved, like they belonged to the house's history, and not to the fear I had built around them. The ending wasn't dramatic or supernatural or loud. It was quiet. It was the kind of ending where the truth wasn't comforting, but it was solid, and solid was enough. The house had reasons for the cold, reasons for the sound, reasons for the strange feeling that something was underneath me. I learned them. I fixed them. And once they were fixed, the fear stopped having a place to grow. I still avoid the small room, though. Not because anything is wrong with it now, but because sometimes the memory of that first breath under the floor comes back to me, and I remember how real it felt before logic stepped in. The room is warm now, stable, normal. But every time I look at it from the hallway, I feel that same stillness in my chest, like the cold is waiting behind the boards, even though I know it isn't. Living there taught me something simple: fear doesn't always come from something impossible. Sometimes it comes from the things that are real, things built into the house long before you ever open the front door. And once you hear them, once you feel them against your skin, you don't forget. When I moved into the house in Atlanta, the mirror in the hallway was the first thing I hated. It was tall, old, and anchored directly into the wall, with thick metal bolts that someone had painted over several times. The frame looked like something pulled from a forgotten motel, scratched on every edge, blotched with stains that had seeped into the wood. I tried pulling at it once, thinking maybe it wasn't as tightly attached as it looked. But the bottom corner lifted the drywall with it. I put it back and let it be. I told myself it was just a mirror. I had bigger things to deal with after the move. For the first few days, I walked past it without thinking. It sat in a narrow stretch of hallway between my bedroom and the bathroom. The overhead light in that hallway flickered sometimes, especially when the air conditioning kicked on. The mirror caught that flicker and stretched it, making the whole length of the glass seem to pulse. Every time I passed it, something in me tensed. It was like the hallway narrowed around me, and the mirror waited for me to look. By the second week, I started noticing a strange feeling when I walked by it. It wasn't fear, not at first. It was more like I wasn't alone. The reflection of the hallway behind me always looked slightly darker than the actual hallway. The shadows had a weight to them, as if someone else walked with me, just outside my line of sight. I kept telling myself it was just the mirror's age, maybe the glass was warped or dirty. Still, every time I crossed in front of it, I sped up. The mirror changed the way I moved around my own house. If I needed something from the kitchen at night, I would take the longer route through the living room so I wouldn't have to walk past it. But even then, I felt it. It was like the mirror sat behind me, even when I wasn't near it, just waiting for me to slip up and look at it again. I told myself I was being dramatic, that I needed sleep, that moving stress was messing with me. But deep down something felt off, and I couldn't explain it away. The first real moment that made me stop pretending came late one night, maybe around 2 in the morning. I had gotten out of bed to get a drink of water. I walked into the hallway half asleep. The air felt cooler than usual, enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. When I passed the mirror, my reflection looked normal at first. Just me, tired and annoyed about being awake. But something in the corner of the reflection caught my eye. It was a faint shape, very close to the surface of the mirror, like someone leaning in. The figure was blurred but tall, standing directly behind where my reflection was. It didn't move. It didn't shift. It stayed completely still, as if it had been there the entire time waiting for me to notice it. I spun around so fast I hit my elbow on the wall. But the hallway behind me was empty. My heart kicked hard in my chest, enough that I felt it in my neck. I turned back toward the mirror, expecting to see nothing and laugh at myself. But the shape didn't vanish right away. It stayed for a moment, like it took time to fade, as if it needed to pull itself back out of the glass. It dissolved slowly, not like a shadow, but like steam clearing from a cold window. I stood there until the mirror showed nothing except the hallway and my 2 wide eyes. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to figure out how a trick of light could behave like that. I tried coming up with explanations. Maybe someone had left residue on the mirror. Maybe my vision blurred. Maybe the temperature change in the hallway created some kind of distortion. I kept telling myself anything that didn't involve something unrealistic. But each answer felt thin, like I was forcing myself to believe something that didn't fit. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid looking into the mirror entirely. I started turning my body toward the far wall when I walked past it. I kept my eyes on the floor. I even thought about hanging a sheet over it, but the idea of touching it again made me feel sick, so I didn't. I just ignored it the best I could. But even without looking at it, I started noticing other things. The cold. At first it was just in the hallway. The air was always at least a few degrees colder there than in the rest of the house. I thought maybe the vent above the door was leaking air. I tested it with my hand, but no draft came out of it. The cold stayed. It got worse at night. Sometimes when I stepped into the hallway, it felt like I had walked into a refrigerator. One night, when I walked past the mirror without looking, I felt something shift in the air behind me. Not a sound. More like a change in pressure. A tiny push of cold air that brushed the back of my neck and moved past me. I froze in place. Every part of me was sure something had been directly behind me, close enough to breathe on me if it wanted to. But nothing else in the hallway moved. Nothing changed. I made myself keep walking. After that, I stopped using the hallway at night. I would wait until morning or turn on every light in the house before going anywhere near it. But even then, walking past the mirror felt like wading into tension. My body always felt stiff. My skin prickled. I didn't feel watched exactly. It was worse. I felt tracked. I finally broke when I woke up one night with the sound of something shifting against the wall outside my bedroom. It was soft, like cloth brushing wood. I sat up and listened. The sound came again, slow and close to the floor. I grabbed my phone and shined the light toward the door, expecting to see nothing. Instead, the light caught the shape of the hallway reflected in the mirror. I could see the mirror from where I sat if the bedroom door was slightly open. And there, in the reflection, something moved. A dark shape, low to the ground, slipping toward the far end of the hall. It wasn't clear, but it moved as though it had weight. It didn't glide. It shifted its weight from one point to another like a person walking slowly in the dark. I jumped out of bed and swung the door closed. I pressed my back against it and stood there in the dark, breathing hard, trying to convince myself that I imagined it. But the sound outside the door continued for a few seconds. Soft, steady, moving away from me, and then it stopped completely. I didn't open the door again until sunrise. That morning, I decided the mirror had to go. I didn't care if it took half the wall with it. I didn't care about patching drywall or repainting. I wanted it out of the house. I got a flathead screwdriver and a hammer and went to the hallway. The air was cold as always. The mirror loomed over the floor like it had been waiting for me. When I touched the frame to find a place to wedge the screwdriver, the wood felt colder than the air around it. Not just cold, icy, like it had been sitting outside in winter. I pulled my hand back, but I forced myself to keep going. I hammered the screwdriver into the side gap and pried. The mirror groaned against the wall. The top bolt loosened. When I pulled harder, the drywall cracked in a long, jagged line. The mirror bent forward for a second, and behind it, I saw the wall. There was a rectangular cutout, about the size of a small storage niche, and inside the opening was insulation dust and something else. Something dark. I leaned closer even though I didn't want to. It was a folded piece of old fabric, pressed into the wall cavity. When I pulled it out, it crumbled slightly at the edges. Dirt and dust dropped to the floor. It was a coat, a heavy winter coat, stiff from age and flattened like it had been shoved in and forgotten. It smelled like mildew and earth. The lining was torn, and the back of it had a stain that had bled through the fabric. A dark, wide stain. I set it on the floor and backed away. I didn't want to touch it again. I didn't want to think about why someone had hidden it behind a mirror instead of throwing it out. I didn't want to think about what that stain might be. It was too real, too practical, too explainable in a way that made my stomach twist. I pulled the rest of the mirror off the wall. It came free with a violent crack, taking chunks of drywall with it. I dragged it outside and leaned it against the fence. I didn't look at it again. When I went back inside, the hallway felt normal. The cold was gone. The air felt the same as the rest of the house. The pressure in my chest eased in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. There was no heaviness, no strange movement, no sense that anything waited for me in the shadows. I patched the hole in the wall over the next few days. I threw out the coat without letting myself inspect it any further. I didn't want answers. I didn't want to know who had put it there or why. I just wanted the house to feel like mine again, and it did. The hallway went silent. The air warmed. The nights felt normal. Nothing moved in the reflections of my windows. Nothing shifted outside my bedroom door. The house became just a house. Looking back, I don't think anything supernatural happened. I think the mirror hid something it shouldn't have. Maybe the person who lived there before me had tried to forget it. Maybe living with that kind of secret pushes your mind into strange places. Maybe the weight of it sits in the walls, waiting for someone else to feel it. All I know is that once the mirror was gone, the house felt lighter. And whatever the truth was, I don't need to know it. I only needed to get rid of the thing that held it. I moved into the house on a dull, wet afternoon in early spring, the kind of day when the sky looks like a sheet of metal, and every sound carries farther than it should. The place was small, old and quiet, which was what I wanted after years of apartment noise. The backyard was larger than most in that neighborhood in St. Louis, tucked behind a leaning fence and a row of overgrown hedges. When I first walked across it, the grass was soft and uneven, and in the far back corner I noticed a strange, rounded mound of dirt. It looked out of place, like someone had dumped soil there years ago and let weeds crawl over it. The seller, during one of the walkthroughs, had waved it off as an abandoned landscaping project. I didn't think much about it. People leave all kinds of half-done things in their yards. For the first few days, I didn't pay attention to the mound at all. I was busy cleaning, unpacking, and getting used to the creaks of the old floors and the way the furnace clicked on with a low groan. The yard itself was quiet. Birds came and went. Squirrels chased each other along the fence. Nothing felt strange. Everything changed after the first heavy rainstorm. It poured all night with loud sheets of water hitting the roof and running down the gutters. The storm was strong enough that the lights flickered once or twice, and the wind pushed the trees around so much that branches scraped the siding. I checked the basement twice during the night to make sure nothing was flooding, and by morning the backyard looked darker than usual, like the soil had soaked in more water than it could handle. As I stepped outside to check the gutters, I saw it. The mound in the back corner had partially collapsed on one side, and a small, dark opening sat in the middle of the exposed dirt. I walked closer, thinking it might be a burrow or a hole left by water erosion. But when I crouched down and leaned in, I felt my stomach tighten. The inside wasn't wet mud. It wasn't messy or broken up like an animal tunnel. It was smooth, packed earth, shaped in straight, deliberate lines. The circle of the opening was almost perfectly round. The tunnel went inward at a slight downward angle, narrowing as it disappeared into the dark. It looked like something a human would dig, if they had nothing but their hands and a lot of time. The thought made the air feel different around me. The wind had died down, but I felt cold across the back of my neck. I didn't touch the walls of the tunnel, but I could imagine the way they would feel. Dense, tight, pressed into shape. I stood up and backed away slowly. The storm didn't do that. Storms tear things open. They don't carve perfect tunnels. I grabbed my phone and called my neighbor from 2 houses down, mostly because I didn't want to stand there alone staring at that hole. He said he would come over in a bit. I kept my distance while waiting, pacing the wet grass, trying to understand what I was looking at. I didn't see any footprints, no signs of digging tools, no loose soil tossed around. The rain should have washed away any fresh dirt if someone had been working on it overnight, but everything looked settled. When my neighbor finally came through the gate, I pointed toward the back corner. Except the hole was gone. At first, I thought I had misjudged the exact spot, but when I walked over, I felt my chest tighten again. The entire opening was sealed, not collapsed, sealed. The soil was stacked and smoothed across the entrance, like someone had pushed it into place from inside the tunnel. The dirt was fresh, lighter in color, packed neatly. There were no signs of water erosion, no clumps, no messy edges. It was clean, like a patch of new work on an old wall. My neighbor stared for a few seconds, said he didn't see anything unusual, and shrugged. I could tell he thought I had misread something, maybe seen a puddle or a shadow. But I knew what I saw, and I knew what it looked like when something was filled in from the outside. This wasn't that. This looked like whoever, or whatever, had been inside that tunnel had sealed it up behind themselves. After he left, the yard felt heavy. I didn't go near the mound for the rest of the day. Every time I walked past a window that faced the backyard, I found myself checking that corner, half expecting to see the opening again. That night, I woke up around 3 in the morning. The house was silent, but for some reason I felt wide awake. I couldn't shake an uneasy pressure in my chest. I walked toward the back window, not sure why I felt drawn there. Outside, the yard was faintly lit by the streetlight behind my fence. The shadows were long and blurry. The mound of dirt looked exactly the same as before. No opening, no change, but I couldn't shake the thought of something moving underneath it. not fast. Just slow, patient movements. Someone lying low under the soil, listening, waiting. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come until the sky was starting to lighten. Over the next week, I tried to ignore the mound. I told myself it had to be old erosion, mixed with the storm, mixed with my imagination. But there were small things that didn't fit. The ground around that area felt softer than it should have been, even when the rest of the yard dried out. The grass around the mound seemed thinner, like it had been disturbed recently. When I stepped near it, the soil felt hollow under my shoe, like there was empty space beneath the surface. One afternoon, I crouched down again and pressed the palm of my hand against the dirt. It was firm but uneven, almost like something had pushed up from beneath then settled back down. The more I looked, the more it felt wrong. The size of it, the shape, the location in the farthest, least visible corner of the yard. It didn't feel like a pile of old soil anymore. It felt like something was under there. I started thinking back to what the tunnel looked like before it vanished. The way it had been carved so cleanly. Something that neat didn't happen by accident. Someone had made it. But why would anyone dig a tunnel into a stranger's backyard? And from where? The nearest alley was too far for a straight crawl tunnel. The neighbors' yards didn't show any piles of dirt or signs of excavation. If someone had dug it from outside the property, they would have needed somewhere to put the soil. That much dirt doesn't just disappear. The only place the soil could have gone was the mound itself. That idea worked its way into my mind slowly, and once it settled, I couldn't get rid of it. The mound wasn't a leftover project. It was all the displaced earth from a tunnel dug from below. Someone had been digging upward. Someone had been trying to break through the surface, and the storm only made the top layer collapse early. The next rainstorm came a few days later. It wasn't as heavy, but the wind was strong, and the fence rattled off and on throughout the night. I stayed awake longer than usual, listening to the sounds outside. When a sudden gust hit the house, I heard a different sound beneath it. A dull shift in the soil. A muted thud. It came from the yard. I sat up in bed and held my breath. The sound didn't repeat, but I knew exactly where it came from. In the morning, I checked the back corner from my kitchen window, expecting to see another opening. There wasn't one. But the mound looked slightly different. Slightly higher. The soil looked like it had been pressed outward, forming a faint ridge along one side. Something had pushed up from underneath again. I didn't go outside. I didn't want to stand near it. I kept thinking about the tunnel walls. Smooth, narrow, made for a body crawling through dark, packed earth. Whoever dug it had been close to the surface. Close to my yard. Maybe they had been doing it for months before I moved in. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The house made ordinary old house noises, but every time something settled or creaked, I found myself listening for sounds from the yard. I imagined soil shifting a few feet below ground, fingers digging upward. A slow, careful scraping. The idea came to me that maybe the person, whoever they were, had been trapped after the collapse. Maybe they were trying to dig their way out again, and had filled the opening only because they heard someone nearby. The thought made my skin crawl. Someone under the ground hearing me walk. I made a decision the next morning. I was going to call someone to take care of it. Not the police. They would think I was overreacting. I would call a private contractor who handled ground surveys and property inspections. Someone who could bring equipment, check for structural risk, maybe even use a ground scanner to see if there was a void under the yard. But before I made the call, I wanted to check the yard one last time. I walked outside slowly, keeping my eyes on the mound. The grass was wet from the night dew, and the soil glistened faintly in the early sunlight. I moved closer, watching for any sign of disturbance. There was something new. Along the very edge of the mound, near the fence line, the soil looked pushed outward again. But this time it wasn't a small shift. It was a clear bulge, as if something long and narrow had pressed upward from underneath before sinking back down. The shape was subtle but unmistakable. It looked like the outline of an arm. I stepped back fast, my heart pounding. I didn't want to get any closer. I didn't want to touch anything. I didn't want to confirm what that shape meant. I walked straight back into the house, locked the door, and sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were shaking while I searched for the number of a property survey service. I booked the earliest appointment they had. They said they could come the next morning. I barely slept that night. I kept imagining movements under the soil, slow and steady, like someone was shifting their body around in a cramped space. I imagined them pausing every time they heard a noise above. Listening. Learning the rhythm of my footsteps. When the inspectors arrived the next day, I directed them to the back corner but stayed near the house. I did not want to stand on that part of the yard again. The team set up their ground scanning equipment and began checking for voids and cavities underground. They moved slowly, methodically, marking spots on a notepad. After nearly an hour, the lead inspector walked back toward me with a strange, tight look on his face. He said the readings showed a long, narrow cavity running beneath the yard, about 3 feet down. It extended past the fence line and continued into the neighbor's property. It wasn't a natural formation. It had straight edges and consistent width. Definitely man-made. He said it looked like a crawl tunnel. He recommended immediate excavation and said he would file a report because structures like that could be dangerous if they collapsed. I asked him if they saw any signs of recent digging. He hesitated, then said the cavity looked freshly maintained, which meant the soil inside had been moved or compacted recently. They scheduled a full excavation for 2 days later. I didn't stay in the house that night. I packed a small bag and slept at a hotel near the city center. Even there, with concrete under me and no yard to worry about, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever dug that tunnel wasn't gone. They had sealed it for a reason. They had pressed themselves into the earth with enough force to leave that outline. The excavation team arrived on schedule. I stood far back while they began removing layers of soil. They worked carefully, cutting a clean trench along the shape the scanner had detected. After about an hour, one of the workers stopped and signaled the others. They had uncovered the top of the tunnel. It was exactly the same size and shape I had seen in the collapse. Packed earth, smooth sides. They kept digging until they opened a long section of it. When they finally reached the deepest part, they stopped again. I heard a low call from one of them, followed by a tense silence. When I walked closer, I saw what they found. The tunnel ended abruptly, like someone had stopped digging mid-motion. There was no body, no tools. But the earth at the end curved inward, forming a tight pocket, and on the surface of the packed soil, faint but clear enough to see, were the marks of hands. Human hands pressed flat against the dirt. The fingers were spread wide. The impressions were deep, as if they had pushed hard, maybe trying to force their way through. The workers didn't know what to make of it. They said the soil was too tightly packed for someone to have moved beyond that point. They suggested it was old, maybe years old. But the impressions looked too defined, too sharp, too recent. I sold the house within a month. I told the buyer the yard had old drainage issues, nothing more. I didn't stay long enough to watch what happened after the excavation crew filled everything in and leveled the ground again. But sometimes, when I think about that mound of dirt and the perfect shape of that tunnel, I imagine someone crawling for months in the dark soil beneath different yards across the block, digging quietly, listening, moving in slow, patient turns. And when they finally reached my yard, they were closer to the surface than anywhere else. Close enough that when the storm opened the top for a moment, they knew exactly how much time they had to seal it again. The house looked simple from the outside, a narrow wooden structure tucked between two newer buildings on a quiet street in Kyoto. I rented it because it felt calm, almost hidden, and I liked the idea of living somewhere with history. The owner told me it was old but solid. When I first stepped inside, the air felt still, like the rooms hadn't been disturbed for a long time. The sliding doors were light, the floors were uneven in places, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear the hum of distant traffic, as if it came from inside the house. I didn't mind. I thought it added character. The first night was quiet enough, but the silence felt heavier than I expected. I set my things down, made a small meal, and tried to settle in, but the house had a way of keeping my attention. Every sound traveled. When I walked across the main hall, the boards gave a soft crack under my feet. When I closed a door, it rattled a little even after I let go. I kept telling myself it was normal for a house this old. I went to bed reminding myself that thin walls always make places feel louder, that I would get used to it in a few days. I must have fallen asleep fast, because the next thing I remember was waking up in the dark to a faint tapping noise. It was soft and spaced evenly, like something light was touching the floor. For a moment, I thought it was rain hitting the exterior, but when I listened more closely, I realized it was inside the house. It sounded like footsteps. Not heavy ones, just quick little steps moving along the hallway outside my room. They paced from one wall to the other, never stopping in the middle, almost as if someone kept turning around at each end. I told myself it had to be the pipes expanding or the wood settling. Houses make strange noises at night. I lay still until the sound faded. I hardly slept after that. The second night, the same thing happened. Soft, steady steps in the hallway. I was already half awake when they began, and I tried to match them with something rational in my mind. Maybe an animal got inside. A cat or something small. But the steps sounded too rhythmic, too human. They moved back and forth with purpose, like someone walking while thinking about something or trying to calm themselves. I got out of bed and walked to the door. My fingers touched the knob, and the sound stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt sharp, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The dim light from the small bulb near the stairs cast a long shadow across the wooden floor. Everything was still. I checked every room but found nothing out of place. I ended up sitting in the kitchen until the sun came up, too wired to sleep. By the third night, I didn't even pretend to ignore the sound. The pacing returned at nearly the same time. Quick, soft steps hitting the floorboards. From my room to the wall near the front door, then back again. Always stopping right outside my bedroom door, as if whoever was walking couldn't decide whether to come in. I tried opening the door fast, hoping I could catch something, even if it was just a draft shifting the boards in a strange way. But the moment my hand touched the knob, the steps stopped again. Every single time. The interruption felt intentional. I didn't want to believe that, so I tried to slow my breathing and think of something logical. Maybe the boards were warped. Maybe the sound carried strangely in the narrow hallway. But the feeling that someone was standing on the other side of the door, listening to me, was hard to shake. On the fourth night, the pacing started earlier than usual. I could hear the steps even while I was still awake, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. This time I decided not to get up. I listened to the pattern of the steps, trying to map where they were moving. The footsteps went from the wall near the kitchen to the spot right by my bedroom. They tapped the floor like someone turning on their heel. Then they went back the other way, repeating the motion again and again. The boards creaked in the same rhythm each time. I waited for the moment they usually stopped, when I touched the door handle, but I stayed in bed, hoping maybe the steps would fade on their own. Instead, they got faster. Not louder, just quicker, like whoever was pacing had become impatient. I felt a pressure in the air, a tightness that made it difficult to breathe. I finally sat up, turned on my small lamp, and walked toward the door. The steps didn't pause. They didn't slow. They continued as if whoever was walking didn't care anymore whether I heard them or not. I opened the door. The hallway was empty, completely still, but the floorboards under my feet trembled lightly, shifting with the weight of something moving nearby. The footsteps continued even though there was nothing in front of me. They passed my left side, close enough that the floor dipped slightly under the pressure. I felt the faintest vibration through the wood. The steps continued past me, moving toward the far wall. Then they looped around as if circling me from behind. I stood frozen. I could feel the soft movement of the boards behind me, then to my right, then directly in front of me again. The steps made a full circle and then continued down the hallway. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the trail of motion around me, like the air shifted in a small, controlled way every time a foot hit the floor. I kept my eyes on the boards, hoping to see something, but they only moved in small dips, the way they might under a person's weight. The pacing didn't stop after I stepped out into the hallway. It only changed direction. Instead of going back and forth, the steps now moved in a slow, deliberate loop from one end of the hall around the corner to the entrance area and back again. The pattern repeated, steady and unbroken. I followed the sound with careful steps, watching how the boards bent slightly ahead of the noise. It looked as if someone invisible was walking just a few inches in front of me. I felt lightheaded, but I kept moving because stopping felt worse. The loop went through the small entryway and past the sliding door that led to the outside. The door rattled each time the steps passed, as if a hand brushed against it. I checked the lock twice. It was still tight. The steps continued along the narrow wall, then back into the hall. It became clear that whatever was causing the movement wasn't floating or drifting. It had weight. Actual weight. Enough to shift the boards and cause faint vibrations through the frame of the house. That detail bothered me more than anything else. It meant there was a physical cause, something with mass, something real. I followed the pacing until it brought me back to my bedroom door. The steps paused there, just for a moment, like they were waiting. Then they continued past me again. I didn't know what else to do, so I stayed awake the rest of the night, standing near the wall with the hallway light turned on. The steps continued for hours, looping and looping, until morning light leaked through the front window. Only then did the pacing slow, soften, and finally fade out. The boards relaxed under my feet, settling back into place. The next day, I went over every inch of the house. I checked under the floors where I could, looked for any gaps or signs of animals. I checked the outside walls, the small yard, the roof line. I looked for anything that could cause steady pressure on the boards, even something mechanical. I found nothing. The structure was old but stable. No loose pipes. No draft strong enough to move the doors. No signs that someone else could be slipping in. I thought about leaving that day, but it bothered me that I didn't understand the cause. I didn't want to run from something I couldn't explain. I stayed one more night, telling myself I would record the sound and show it to someone in the morning. The pacing returned around the same time, but something was different. The steps were slower, as if whoever or whatever caused them was tired or cautious. They still traveled the same path, the same loop through the hallway and around the corner. But when they reached the entrance area, they lingered. The boards dipped slightly deeper than before. It reminded me of someone standing still for a long moment, deciding something. Then the steps moved to the front door. I watched the wooden panel bend in a subtle curve, like someone was leaning against it. The lock clicked lightly, not fully, but with enough force that I heard the metal shift. I stayed completely still. The footsteps moved away from the door and continued their loop, slower now. I realized the movement wasn't random. It wasn't restless energy or some strange trick of an old frame. It was a pattern, a habit, a repeated road of someone who had lived there before me. Someone who walked that path every night out of routine. Someone whose weight was still carved into the boards in a way that made them respond even now, long after that person was gone. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost. The house was old, and its structure had been worn into specific shapes by years of someone pacing that same path. Each step I heard was the wood reacting to pressure points from the past, flexing and shifting as the temperature dropped at night, releasing tension in a rhythm that matched the steps of whoever had lived there before. The boards were warped in the exact pattern of those footsteps, so the sound repeated as the air cooled and the wood expanded and contracted. Understanding that helped, but it didn't make the house feel any less alive. For days I timed the pacing, listened as the boards dipped and relaxed. The route never changed. It was a loop someone must have walked hundreds of nights in a row. I pictured a person walking that hallway over and over, maybe from stress or insomnia or habit. The house remembered them through the way the boards moved. The explanation was real and simple, but it didn't feel comforting. It felt like living inside someone else's routine, someone else's problems, someone else's sleepless nights. I tried staying longer, but the constant pacing wore me down. It kept me from resting, kept me from feeling like the place was mine. Each night, the floor repeated that pattern until I knew it too well, until it felt like the house belonged more to the footsteps than to me. I moved out at the end of the month. When the owner asked why, I said the place felt too old for me, too unsettled. I didn't tell him the details. I didn't want to hear whether he already knew. When I locked the door for the last time, the hallway behind me felt quiet, but the image of the boards dipping under invisible weight stayed with me. Even now, when a floor creaks in a certain rhythm at night, I feel the same tightness in my chest. Not because I think something is there, but because I know how a house can hold the weight of someone long after they're gone, repeating their steps long enough to make you feel like they never really left.